Tolstoy introduces the most doomed woman in his universe, not by her soul or her fears, but by a minor physical defect that makes her upper lip too short to cover her teeth. He dwells on this lip, insisting that her inability to close her mouth seemed to be her own special and peculiar form of beauty. She carries her pregnancy lightly, chatters in French, and is entirely defined by this small inadequacy that forces her into a perpetual childish half smile. This isn't just physical description. It's a diagnosis of her absolute inability to survive what's coming. Because that lip guarantees she'll only ever be treated as a pet. It guarantees her husband will suffocate in her presence, and it guarantees she'll die bewildered, having never possessed the biological machinery required to shut her mouth and face the terror of her own life. We think we're reading a historical epic about free individuals navigating a geopolitical crisis, but Tolstoy's actually building a horror story about biological and social clockwork. Look at Anna Pavlovna Scherer's drawing room. When Pierre enters, he doesn't just commit a faux pas. He threatens the physical operation of a textile mill. Anna Pavlovna manages her guests so the spindles hummed steadily and ceaselessly on all sides. She feeds her visitors into the machinery, weaving their predictable reactions into a continuous hum of acceptable political outrage. When the Vicomte tells his anecdote about the Duc d'Enghien, he isn't having a conversation. He's executing a programmed maneuver for an audience calibrated to express exactly the correct volume of dismay. Prince Vasily speaks languidly, like an actor repeating a stale part, deliberately stripping his own words of any genuine emotional content before they even reach the air, operating strictly within a register where expressing horror at Bonaparte's executions isn't moral revulsion, but the mechanical prerequisite for securing his idiot son a diplomatic post in Vienna. Pierre thinks he's breaking the machinery by staging a disagreement. He defends Napoleon, declaring that if it were a war for freedom, I could understand it, but that fighting the greatest man in the world isn't right. His friend, Prince Andrew, doesn't even bother to argue the politics because Andrew knows the politics are just noise. Andrew's enlisting for a completely different reason. I am going because the life I am leading here does not suit me. He advises Pierre to never marry till you can say to yourself that you have done all you are capable of, blaming his pregnant, short-lived wife for his own spiritual suffocation. Andrew despises the women of his own class, insisting there's a difference between the Kuragins' dissipated set and women who are comme il faut. Comme il faut translates as proper or socially acceptable, but Tolstoy deploys it as a structural engineering term. Think of comme il faut as a deep sea diving bell, a rigid, heavily pressurized iron sphere that keeps the crushing weight of the actual chaotic universe from instantly liquefying the aristocrats inside, allowing them to breathe perfectly filtered, artificial air while pretending they're swimming freely in the ocean. Andrew thinks he can just step out of the bell by putting on a uniform. He's completely wrong. He goes to Bald Hills to leave his wife with his father, the old Prince Bolkonski, nicknamed the King of Prussia. You'd expect the harsh, isolated country estate to offer an antidote to Petersburg's empty social performance, but the old prince runs a factory far more tyrannical than Anna Pavlovna's salon. He divides all human failure into idleness and superstition and forces Princess Mary to study geometry just to break her spirit. When the old prince leans over his terrified daughter, wrapping her in the acrid scent of old age and tobacco while scratching his hard nail from one paragraph to another in a mathematics textbook, he isn't teaching her algebra. He's systematically grinding down her capacity for independent thought so she'll never leave him, securing his own domestic comfort under the guise of intellectual rigor. He demands the universe behave like the snuff boxes he turns on his lathe, measurable, predictable, and obedient to his tools. He dismisses the new military strategies, insisting instead on a simultaneous expedition, refusing to accept that a real war can't be planned with a compass and a protractor. He sits in his powdering mantle, entrusting his head to his servant Tikhon, while mocking the idea that Bonaparte is a genius. He terrorizes his household. He controls them completely. The terror of the novel isn't the battlefield. It's the absolute mechanization of the human soul. The standard defense against this reading is to point to the Rostovs. You look at their chaotic name day party and think you've finally found life. Natasha kisses Boris among the flower tubs. Sonia cries hysterically over Nicholas. It all feels spontaneous, but it's just another clockwork system driven by biology instead of etiquette. Sonia isn't a tragic heroine. Tolstoy explicitly describes her as a kitten ready to display her kittenish nature. She acts entirely on chemical instinct. We want to believe that Natasha, boldly screaming across a crowded dining table to demand whether the dessert is carrot ice or pineapple ice, represents an escape from the crushing artificiality of the adults. But her rebellion's entirely sanctioned by the room, functioning as a necessary temporary exhaust valve for a society that fully expects her to eventually harden into a fatigued, calculating matriarch exactly like her mother. Even economic survival is purely mechanical. Watch Princess Anna Mikhailovna hustle for her son Boris. She isn't driven by malice. She's driven by the sheer gravitational pull of poverty. She weeps with Countess Rostova over their shared youth, immediately accepts a wad of clean notes, to equip her son for the guards, and then forces her way past a hostile relative into the dying Count Bezukhov's bedroom to ensure Pierre gets his inheritance. She plays the role of the grieving friend flawlessly, but her grief never interrupts her financial calculations. She's an economic piston firing exactly as designed. This creates a devastating problem for Tolstoy that he never entirely solves. He's trying to write an epic about good and evil, but he's constructed a universe where the gears are so visible that moral judgment collapses. He strips away the illusion of agency from his characters so thoroughly that when Prince Andrew abandons his pregnant wife to the tyranny of his father, we can't even blame him because we've seen the exact pulleys that forced him out the door. If character's destiny, and destiny's dictated by the shape of your upper lip, the hum of a drawing room, or the frantic pulsing of a kitten's blood, then no one's actually guilty. The cost of Tolstoy's psychological brilliance is the total erasure of moral responsibility. You can't put a lathe on trial, and you can't punish a spindle for spinning. By proving that every human action is the inevitable result of intersecting pressures: etiquette, poverty, biology, geometry. Tolstoy accidentally builds a world where sin doesn't exist, only physics. We're left watching a magnificent array of gears grinding each other to dust, desperately hoping the machine will somehow learn to forgive itself. The most embarrassing thing a military commander can do in Tolstoy's universe is try to issue a direct order. If you want to understand the architecture of human delusion, you don't start with the gunfire. You start with the bureaucracy. Watch the commander in chief, Kutuzov, inspecting his regiments at Braunau. He isn't assessing their readiness to fight. He's explicitly hoping to show an Austrian general how wretched they look, using the miserable condition of his own men as a diplomatic lever to avoid joining a doomed offensive. The entire hierarchy's a fiction maintained by optics. The moment the degraded officer Dolokhov stares down his sputtering regimental commander in the ranks, his insolent blue eyes tear open the veil of convention, separating a general from a private, exposing the sheer fragility of military authority. That's the baseline reality. But Prince Andrew rides out to the Battle of Hollabrunn, expecting to find an orchestra, and finds instead Prince Bagration nodding at a landslide. Andrew's hunting for the geometry of war, sketching a precise plan of the position in his notebook, and preparing to report on the deployment of battalions. What he encounters instead is the concept of command as pure reactive theater. Tolstoy writes that Bagration tried to make it appear that everything done by necessity or accident was actually done in accord with his intentions. Tolstoy calls this specific administrative pantomime tact. Tact here isn't about politeness. It's an epistemological survival strategy. Think of a man trapped in the back of a runaway wagon who nods approvingly every time the wheels hit a rut, convincing the terrified passengers he's steering the very boulders in the road. Prince Andrew expects a master tactician, but instead he finds a man who merely nods at chaos, uttering very good to every report of a desperate localized reaction, creating the illusion that the blood and the blunders are unfolding exactly according to a grand invisible design. Andrew's fundamentally unequipped for this reality. He's spent his time at headquarters vibrating with the desire to be the hero of a rational narrative. He wants to save the army and earn the Maria Theresa order. When he brings news of an earlier minor victory to the Austrian court, he runs headlong into the diplomat Bilibin, who stages the exact counter-argument to Andrew's earnestness. Bilibin insists that as a consistent philosopher, Andrew's only duty is to take care of himself and retreat to the comfortable parlors of Olmütz. The real disagreement here isn't between bravery and cowardice. It's about the underlying mechanics of history. Bilibin recognizes the diplomatic subtleties, and the cheering for the Orthodox Greek faith are just rhetorical noise covering up the grim geopolitical reality that Bonaparte's already taken Vienna and Austria's secretly negotiating peace. Bilibin knows the system's a machine that runs on self-interest, while Andrew still thinks it runs on honor. Andrew rides out to save the army anyway, entirely missing the point that armies aren't saved by pristine officers on horseback. They're saved by Captain Tushin. Tushin's the living refutation of the military academy. He sits in the sutler's tent without his boots, philosophizing about the soul, and when the bombardment starts, he doesn't wait for a courier. While the staff officers draft immaculate maps of outflanking maneuvers that'll never happen, a barefoot artillery captain in a state of feverish delirium manages to halt the entire French advance by hallucinating that his cannon's a woman named Matvevna, and he's a giant hurling iron with his bare hands. He doesn't hold the center because he understands the tactical stakes. He holds it because he's completely dissolved into the bloody, localized physics of the moment. He operates by delirium. The strongest objection to this reading is that Tolstoy's just doing cheap romantic populism, praising the noble, earthy peasant soldier over the corrupt intellectual. But the move's more careful than that. Tolstoy isn't praising ignorance. He's diagnosing the fatal limit of human bandwidth. If you retain your sense of a rational, overarching self in a crossfire, you'll end up like the young cadet Nicholas Rostov. Rostov rides into his first charge, expecting the thrill of the attack, But the moment his horse gets shot, the psychological architecture of his universe caves in. He crosses the unseen dividing line between the armies expecting the joyful culmination of his cavalry training, only to find himself stranded on the freezing ground, utterly bewildered that these approaching men with hooked noses and blue cloaks want to murder a boy whose mother loves him so dearly. Rostov's panics the paralyzing cost of remaining an individual. Tushin survives his exposure to the meat grinder exactly because he abandons his individual ego, embracing a psychological state where the terror of death is entirely overwritten by the immediate mechanical demands of working the guns. The map's an alibi. This brings us to the hardest, most uncomfortable reality in the text. Tushin holds the line, setting the village of Schöngrabern on fire and securing the retreat of the entire Russian force. And for his trouble, he's hauled before the generals in a crowded hut and reprimanded for losing 2 guns. He stands there with his lower jaw trembling, staring at Bagration like a schoolboy who's blundered, terrified of getting someone else in trouble by mentioning there were no covering troops. Prince Andrew steps in to defend him, but walks away depressed, finally realize the Wunderkind, the machinery of authority can't tolerate the mechanics of its own salvation. If you actually manage to hold the center and save the army, you won't be pinned with medals by a grateful sovereign. You'll be dragged before a committee of embarrassed men in clean uniforms and scolded for misplacing their equipment because your survival's an insult to their paperwork. On the eve of the Battle of Austerlitz, Prince Dolgorukov stands in the Tsar's headquarters at Olmutz, spreads a map across a table, and issues the most doomed sentence in 19th century literature. All eventualities have been foreseen. He points at lines of ink representing thousands of Russian and Austrian infantrymen perfectly aligned, ready to march down the Pratzen Heights and crush Napoleon's right flank. It's a gorgeous fiction. 12 hours later, those ink lines will dissolve into a freezing fog. The carefully sequenced columns will walk straight into an ambush, and an entirely different mechanism will take over. A sudden, unreasoning panic that Tolstoy notes is communicated rapidly, imperceptibly, and irrepressibly as water does in a creek. Dolgorukov's map is a monument to a specific lethal delusion, the belief that a singular human will can orchestrate the chaotic collective inertia of a crowd. Tolstoy isn't just diagnosing a tactical error. He's staging a full-scale assault on the illusion of individual agency, proving that the exact same terrifying gravity operates far from the front lines. When Pierre Bezukhov inherits his massive fortune, he doesn't deliberately choose to marry the vacuous Helene Kuragina. He actively suspects there's something wrong in the physical pull she exerts on him when her corset creaks as she leans over a snuff box. But Pierre is trapped in a social machinery just as relentless as the Austrian battle plan. Prince Vasily doesn't even have to hatch a master scheme. He simply behaves like a predatory social animal, capitalizing on the room's momentum. The guests, the smiles, and the calculated seating arrangements silently push Pierre into a corner until he feels his marriage is a settled fact. Pierre sits beside her at supper, isolated from his own volition, concluding that all this had to be and could not be otherwise. He surrenders to the sheer pressure of other people's assumptions. This friction between the official rules we invent and the raw momentum we actually obey dictates the military hierarchy just as ruthlessly as the drawing room. Out on the front lines, Boris Drubetskoy quickly realizes the formal military code he learned in the regiment is a joke compared to the unwritten law of proximity to power. He sees that a low-ranking lieutenant chatting with the right adjutant has already risen above a purple-faced general who holds the official power to annihilate him. If the official chain of command is a system of dry, measured canals, the unwritten law is the flash flood that instantly carves its own channels through the dirt. It bypasses the structure entirely, rewarding whoever understands the immediate, unspoken currents of authority. At the very top of this delusion sit Emperor Alexander and his Austrian counterpart, who genuinely believe they're commanding an army. The only man immune to the hallucination is Kutuzov. At the Council of War, while the Austrian chief of staff reads out his dense strategic dispositions, Kutuzov literally sleeps through the meeting. This isn't laziness. It's a radical philosophical rejection of the premise. Kutuzov knows that attempting to dictate a battle from a tent is absurd. When Alexander impatiently demands to know why the army hasn't attacked, Kutuzov drops his authority entirely. He puts on the air of a subordinate who obeys without reasoning and gives the order to advance. The conflict between the emperor and Kutuzov isn't a tactical dispute over holding the high ground. It's a fundamental collision between the belief that history is driven by the rational choices of great men and the grim knowledge that history is a landslide, and the most a general can do is watch the rocks fall. When the French suddenly appear through the fog, shattering the center of the Russian line, a bleeding Kutuzov points to the panicked, fleeing soldiers instead of his own face, flatly stating, "The wound is not here, it is there." Kutuzov's despair is born from his terrifying awareness that the mass of humanity can't be steered once it gains momentum, a reality most men will do anything to avoid facing. Look at Nicholas Rostov patrolling the mist the night before the battle. He's desperate to sacrifice himself for Emperor Alexander. When the army is routed and Rostov actually stumbles across his adored monarch, standing alone near a ditch, he's too paralyzed by hero worship to speak. He thinks he's showing respect, but he's actually protecting his own fantasy. If he approaches Alexander, he'll have to see that the Tsar is just a frightened man on a horse who's completely lost control of his own army. Rostov retreats in despair, clinging to the myth. Months later, when he bursts into his Moscow home, throwing off his fur coat and kissing every relative in sight, he isn't just celebrating a homecoming. He's running back into the comforting theater of domestic life, because the alternative, admitting that the world is a chaotic slaughterhouse ruled by chance, is mentally intolerable. Prince Andrew Bolkonski, on the other hand, tries to conquer that chaos through sheer screaming willpower. He goes into Austerlitz chasing his Toulon Cree, that singular moment of triumph that will elevate him above the herd. He's so infected by the Napoleonic myth that he confesses to himself he'd gladly sacrifice his father, his sister, and his pregnant wife for a moment of glory, of triumph over men, of love from men I don't know and never shall know. When the Russian line breaks, Andrew grabs a heavy standard, shouts in a voice piercing as a child's, and charges toward the French battery. He gets his chance. He falls on his back. Instead of the validation he craved, he opens his eyes to the lofty, infinite sky. This isn't a poetic flourish. The sky is Tolstoy's ultimate sledgehammer against human vanity. As Andrew bleeds into the dirt, listening to the burning, lacerating pain in his head, Napoleon himself rides up. The architect of the age, the idle Andrew, was ready to trade his family to emulate, looks down at the bleeding Russian, and declares his death fine. But Andrew barely hears him. Napoleon's been reduced to a small, insignificant creature, buzzing like a fly. The emperor's petty victory means absolutely nothing when measured against the vast indifference of the great all or nothing. Even the little gold icon that Princess Mary sews onto his uniform offers no real comfort against the crushing scale of this void, leaving him to wonder if he's praying to a benevolent God or just shouting his agony into an empty atmospheric abyss. All of our social climbing, all of our desperate military maneuvers, and all of our agonizing attempts to force the world to obey our blueprints are nothing more than the thrashing of helpless animals caught in a current they refuse to acknowledge. You aren't the author of your own life. Your deepest intentions will be hijacked by the collective panic of the people standing next to you. Your grandest victories will be accidents of geography, and your ultimate revelation will only arrive when you're lying paralyzed in the mud, finally forced to see that the sky doesn't care whether you conquer a continent or bleed to death in a ditch. Old Prince Bolkonski drops his chisel at the exact moment he learns his son has likely been killed at Austerlitz. He lets the tool fall, but the heavy machinery of his workshop doesn't stop. As Tolstoy writes, the wheel continued to revolve by its own impetus, and Princess Mary long remembered the dying creak of that wheel, which merged in her memory with what followed. This is the exact mechanical blueprint of the Russian aristocracy in the winter of 1806. The military campaign against Napoleon is paused. The men are home on leave, and the heavy machinery of peacetime has been switched on, spinning entirely on its own accumulated, terrifying momentum. You don't need a French battery to slaughter these people. You just need to leave them alone in a Moscow drawing room with their own arbitrary codes of honor, and they'll systematically dismantle their own lives with the precise, unthinking rotation of a foot treadle lathe. Pierre Bezukhov at the English Club is a case study in this mechanical ruin. He doesn't actually believe the anonymous letter claiming his wife is sleeping with Dolokhov. He knows the letter is a mean, jocular fraud, and he knows Dolokhov is a ruthless bully. Yet when Dolokhov snatches a printed cantata from his hand, Pierre feels something terrible and monstrous rising in his soul and challenges a trained killer to a duel without even knowing how the trigger of his own pistol works. Pierre surrenders to an aristocratic logic that demands blood for a slight he doesn't believe happened. The sheer absurdity of it peaks in the Sokolniki forest. Pierre shoots blindly into the mist, hits his target by pure luck, and then wanders the woods muttering incoherent apologies, while Dolokhov, bleeding out, sucks and swallows cold snow to find a firm center of gravity so he can return fire. The disagreement over Dolokhov's nature is really Tolstoy staging a debate about the architecture of human cruelty. Nicholas Rostov, blinded by the glamour of a dashing rake, insists to his sister that you have to understand the man's deep soul, pointing out that Dolokhov is passionately devoted to his old mother and hunchback sister. Old Mary Ivanovna even tells Nicholas that her son is too noble and pure-souled for our present depraved world. Natasha almost quarrels with her brother over it, refusing to be charmed, insisting with resolute self-will that the man is simply wicked and heartless. We're trained by bad literature to think the superficial young girl is missing the nuance, that Nicholas sees the deeper psychological truth. Natasha is entirely right. Dolokhov's weeping over his adored angel mother doesn't mitigate his cruelty. it authorizes it. His rigid division of the world, people he'd give his life for, and everyone else whom he'd throttle if they stood in my way, is exactly the psychological permit he needs to bleed his friend dry at the card table. That sadism crystallizes at the English hotel, where Nicholas goes to lose money he doesn't possess. Dolokhov doesn't just fleece his friend in a random run of bad luck. He calculates a target of exactly 43,000 rubles, because 43 is the sum of his own age and the age of Sonia, the 16-year-old girl who just rejected his proposal. Nicholas watches this happening, knows he's ruining his family, and knows he's in the power of a man playing with him as a cat does a mouse. Yet he keeps betting because the artificial rules of the game have entirely usurped the real world, forcing him to feign a bold, free, and easy tone. The arbitrary math problem is treated as an inescapable law of physics. He even tries to smile a stupid, careless smile while internally recognizing himself as a worthless scoundrel whose whole life couldn't atone for his crime. The psychological mechanism operating here is what Tolstoy calls the fascination and delight of frenzy. Pierre feels it later when he brandishes a marble tabletop at his wife, Helene shrieking at her to get out with a voice so terrible the whole house hears it with horror. It's the sudden, intoxicating bypass of the moral braking system. It operates exactly like a deep sea diver experiencing nitrogen narcosis, where the immense, crushing pressure of the water suddenly registers as a warm, euphoric invitation to tear off the oxygen regulator and breathe the ocean. The heavy social pressures of Moscow, the debts, the forced marriages, the anonymous letters, the suffocating presence of the old countess waiting up with patience cards, build until the characters actively crave the violence that'll shatter the pressure vessel. They don't stumble into ruin, they sprint toward it. The the ultimate casualty of all this spinning machinery isn't the men who invent the games. It's the bodies they disregard. Lise, the little princess, goes into labor just as her husband, Prince Andrew, unexpectedly returns from the dead. She doesn't understand the cosmic irony of his arrival. She only knows the biological agony. Prince Andrew watches her suffer, and when she dies in childbirth, her charming, childlike face, with its upper lip covered with tiny black hair, freezes into a terrible, unanswerable accusation. I love you all, and have done no harm to anyone. And what have you done to me? He couldn't weep. The men play at death with loaded pistols and play at ruin with paper money. But Lise's body is the raw, unromantic material that actually snaps under the strain. She didn't consent. We expect a reckoning for this destruction, a moment where the gravity of Nicholas's betrayal forces a permanent domestic crisis. But what actually happens is that Natasha opens her mouth to sing a barcarolle, hits a high note with untrained, velvety softness and accidentally abolishes the entire ethical universe. Nicholas, carrying a ruinous debt that'll devastate his father, listens to his sister take a high C and feels his soul vibrate with the chord. He decides instantly that all losses, all debts, and all words of honor are meaningless against the purity of that sound. He realizes you could kill and rob and yet be happy. This isn't the redemptive power of art. It's the revelation that aesthetic ecstasy doesn't elevate the conscience. It completely anesthetizes it, giving us total permission to be monsters as long as the melody holds. And then Pierre Bezukhov decides his misery's just a geometry problem. He's sitting in his Petersburg study, staring at a square, a Masonic symbol where one side represents God, another moral things, a third physical things, and the fourth a combination of them all. He's recently met an old man at a post station who looked at his ruined, aimless life and offered him the science of the whole, a system promising to explain creation and man's exact place in it. The science of the whole functions for Pierre exactly like a master key in a building where every lock's completely rusted shut. It doesn't actually turn any individual mechanism of human behavior, but holding it in his hand convinces him he's got frictionless access to the universe. When you're enormously wealthy, aimless, and married to a woman who despises you, the most seductive narcotic on earth's the assurance that your suffering's just a miscalculation. So Pierre writes enthusiastic letters to his brother instructor and heads south to free his serfs. He bans corporal punishment, orders hospitals built, and insists women nursing babies aren't sent to work. He thinks he's laying the stones of a great spiritual temple, but the math fails. Pierre's handing his chief steward a shiny new vocabulary for extortion. The steward realizes instantly that if he shows Pierre architectural plans for a hospital, he can quietly increase the serfs' obligatory manorial work by a half, allowing the young count to ride in his Vienna carriage through supposedly thriving villages, weeping with philanthropic joy, completely blind to the fact that his geometric salvations simply optimized the mechanism of peasant exhaustion. Pierre wants virtue as a management policy. He doesn't want to look closely at the men working the fields. He's looking at his pristine ledger. Pierre takes this moral spreadsheet to Bogucharovo to save his friend, but Prince Andrew's already built a different kind of fortress. Andrew survived Austerlitz's slaughter and his wife's death, and he's reached a brutally simple conclusion. The only good's the absence of pain. His whole philosophy is now just avoiding remorse and illness. Pierre pleads for the duty we owe to Le, Le Prochain, but Andrew treats the neighbor the way a burn victim treats a doorknob, viewing attachment as a contaminated surface, guaranteed to tear off whatever fragile skins manage to grow, insisting the only rational response to a random slaughtering universes to aggressively contract your borders until they contain only yourself. Andrew argues physical labors biologically necessary for a peasant and trying to awaken spiritual needs in a serf only deprives the man of the animal happiness, serving as his sole available comfort. The debate reaches its breaking point when they cross a flooded river on a raft. Andrew flatly denies. Logical argument proves a future life. He states you're only convinced when a person bound up with your own life vanishes into nowhere, and you yourself for left facing that abyss and look in. Pierre insists this abyss proves a grander design's existence. He points to the sky, and for a moment, the sound of the waves beating against the raft whispers to Andrew that Pierre's right. The high, everlasting sky from the battlefield wakes up in his soul. It's a gorgeous aesthetic thrill. It alters absolutely nothing about how he lives his life. While Pierre and Andrew argue over whether human suffering's a spiritual test or an avoidable illness, Nicholas Rostov confronts the raw material of their debate. Rostov rides to a Prussian hospital to find his commander, Denisov, who's facing court-martial for hijacking a food transport to feed his starving hussars. Denisov's furiously writing a defense of his actions, refusing to submit to the authorities who starved his men. Rostov expects to find a mechanism of justice that'll recognize the noble desperation behind Denisov's crime, but instead he finds a logistical nightmare where a single doctor lazily manages 400 rotting bodies, where the air itself smells so densely of decomposing flesh that a healthy man's got to pause and collect his strength just to walk down the hall. An army isn't a brotherhood here, it's an industrial disposal site. Rostov walks into a corridor and finds an unconscious Cossack with a purple face and bare red legs, knocking the back of his head against the floorboards, hoarsely begging for water. The doctor dismisses Denisov as probably dead without checking. The hospital's physical reality shreds the romantic illusion of military glory. Rostov flees this nightmare and rides to Tilsit to deliver Denisov's petition to the emperor for a pardon. He arrives on the exact day they're signing the preliminaries of peace. Rostov's suddenly forced to reconcile the hoarse screams of the dying Cossack and his friend's unpardoned disgrace with the cheerful geopolitical pageantry happening in the street, realizing his sovereign's perfectly at ease, exchanging pleasantries with the specific architect of his army's mutilation. He watches Bonaparte, humanity's enemy, grinning in a blue uniform. He watches this same Napoleon publicly pin the Legion of Honor on a Russian soldier named Lazarev. If the Emperor's alliance with this butcher's right, then the rotting men on the straw were a cosmic joke, and all of Rostov's sacrifices mean nothing. He's forced to choose between his sanity and his loyalty. That choice's mechanism requires the deliberate annihilation of his own intellect. Sitting at a hotel table, his face flushed with uncalled for wrath, he begins shouting at his fellow officers. We're not diplomatic officials. We're soldiers and nothing more, he yells. He insists if they begin judging and arguing, nothing sacred will be left. To keep the world from shattering, Rostov violently rejects the act of thinking itself. He stops thinking entirely. He demands another bottle of wine and screams for everyone to drink. He's got to drink because if he stays sober for one more minute, he'll be forced to look closely at the shape in front of him. A Russian battalion stands on the right, and a French Guards battalion stands on the left. 4 perfectly straight lines of men in uniform, enclosing a neat, empty space where the emperor's smile, containing God, morality, the physical world, and all the blood required to keep the lines drawn straight. Tolstoy's most brutal insight into human psychology is that a man's intellectual certainty about his own fate is utterly defenseless against local botany. You can build an entire philosophical architecture around your own misery, convincing yourself your emotional necrosis is a permanent objective truth, and then a random tree by the side of the road ruins the whole project. Prince Andrew spends 2 years continuously in the country cultivating an aristocratic despair, managing his estates with a practical tenacity that effortlessly solves all the problems. Pierre couldn't fix. He identifies so intensely with an old, gnarled oak tree that he decides it's an aged, stern, and scornful monster, mocking the stupid, meaningless, constantly repeated fraud of spring. He looks at this dead wood, decides that our life is finished, and treats this as a verified biological fact rather than a mood, letting the barren branches stand as the ultimate guarantor of his own withdrawal from the world. But the withdrawal is a farce. It takes exactly one overheard conversation from a 16-year-old girl who wants to sit on her heels and fly into the night sky, followed by a second glance at that same oak, quite transfigured, spreading out a canopy of sappy, dark green foliage to completely dismantle 2 years of curated stoicism. Andrew is instantly seized by an unreasoning springtime feeling of joy and renewal, abandoning his monastic retreat to hurl himself back into Petersburg society. Ideology doesn't cure ideology. Physiology cures it. Yet, the moment Andrew gets to Petersburg, he tries to translate this raw biological surge back into paperwork. He channels his renewed life force into drafting a proposal for the reform of Army regulations, taking an appointment to the Committee of Army Regulations as if the state apparatus could somehow absorb the excess sap of his own spiritual revival. Pierre Bezukhov makes the exact same error in a different register. After delivering a moralistic speech to his Masonic lodge and meeting predictable resistance, he collapses into a 3-day depression until his mentor gives him a notebook. Pierre is told the chief duty of a true Mason lies in perfecting himself, which he interprets as a mandate to micromanage his soul through administrative bookkeeping. His mentor advises him to take up only second grade posts in the Petersburg Lodge while doing this work. Taking second grade posts is Pierre's way of playing dead to avoid predators. It's an institutional camouflage where pretending to have no structural power allows you to preserve your intellectual vanity when your actual ideas are rejected by the people you're trying to save. He takes his notoriously unfaithful wife back into his house, but insists their union must have only a spiritual aim, deciding he must bear my cross and recording all his actions in his new ledger. He thinks he's achieving moral purity, but he's really just operating a spiritual abacus, trying to balance his emotional accounts so he doesn't have to feel the humiliation of his marriage. When Pierre inducts Boris into the Masons, he feels a sudden, violent hatred for the young man's obvious social climbing, but the hatred is pure projection. Boris is simply using the lodge to advance his career, whereas Pierre is using it to launder his cowardice, which is a far more insidious kind of ambition. While Pierre hides in his diary, his wife Helene, whom he knows to be incredibly stupid, effortlessly conquers Petersburg by establishing a salon. Stupidity, Tolstoy notes, is exactly what's required to run a successful salon because it creates a vacuum that other people's vanities rush to fill. Helene's reputation becomes so firmly established, she can say the emptiest things, and her guests look for a hidden depth she doesn't possess. She's a masterpiece of social varnish, a woman whose entire existence is predicated on being observed and interpreted by a room. Both men are terrified of the raw, unmediated present. They throw up endless systems, military reforms, Masonic grades, spiritual ledgers, and curated salons to buffer themselves against the sheer chaotic violence of being alive. Then comes the ball, which destroys all these buffers for Andrew. Natasha Rostova doesn't have a system. She just has a pulse beating 100 to the minute and a gossamer skirt requiring 3 maids biting off threads to fix at the last second. When she enters the ballroom, She isn't thinking about the emperor or the diplomatic corps. She's exclusively consumed by the terrifying possibility that no one will ask her to dance. When Andrew steps forward and takes her waist, the Speransky reforms evaporate. But the collision between his abstract ideals and her immediate reality produces a horrifying friction. When Andrew stands by the clavichord listening to Natasha sing a few days later, he isn't crying out of mere sentimental affection. He's choking on the sudden, vivid sense of the terrible contrast between something infinitely great and illimitable within him and that limited and material, something that he and even she was dot. There is the actual wound. He recognizes that the infinite spiritual ideal he carries in his head is fundamentally incompatible with the finite, sweating, breathing girl sitting in front of him. But instead of surrendering the ideal, he attempts to synthesize them through the ultimate bureaucratic compromise, the 1 year delay. When his spiteful, aging father makes it an express condition that the wedding be postponed for a year, Andrew weaponizes this demand under the guise of nobility. He binds himself forever, but tells Natasha she retains perfect freedom. This creates a vacuum in the house, characterized by a poetic dullness. Where the engaged couple rarely speaks, the entire room sits around in awkward silence. And the sheer vitality that attracted him to her in the first place is slowly suffocated by reverence. He thinks he's being noble, but he's actually subjecting a live organism to a bureaucratic timetable. This poetic dullness isn't a romantic piece, but a suspension of animation. To enforce this delay on a girl who operates entirely on immediate sensory consumption is like expecting a lit fuse to patiently hold its spark while you consult a fire safety manual. You aren't preserving the flame, you're just ensuring the explosion happens off schedule and out of your control. Andrew demands biology submit to a calendar, insisting she needs time to know herself. Natasha, sobbing she'll die, waiting a year, understands what Andrew refuses to see. Time doesn't clarify desire, it degrades it. And this is where the opening logic violently reasserts itself. Andrew believed he could rationally manage his own renewal, just as he once believed he could rationally manage his despair. But a man who thinks he's mastered the seasons just because he noticed the leaves changing is setting a trap for himself. He goes abroad to cure his health and test her love, trusting the logic of the calendar over the messy, material reality of the girl who kissed him. He leaves her to the winter, forgetting that the old oak didn't sprout its dark green foliage because it decided an adequate testing period had passed. But because the bark grew warm, the sap rose, and it had absolutely no choice in the matter. 130 dogs and 20 horsemen ride out into the autumn frost, but the entire hierarchy of the Russian Empire dissolves when an old gray-haired huntsman named Daniel sees his master let a wolf slip past. Daniel doesn't pause to remember he's a serf, or that Count Ilya Rostov owns him. He rides up on his sweating chestnut gelding, flashes eyes full of lightning at the nobleman who pays for his existence, holds his whip up like a weapon, and shouts, "Blast you! You've let the wolf go." What sportsman? The Count's frightened and shamefaced. He takes the abuse because out here in the freezing rye fields, the social contract's entirely suspended, replaced by an older, more violent taxonomy where the peasant cornering the wolf becomes king, the nobleman missing, the shot becomes a liability, and the property ledger's meaningless against the smell of wet fur. When Nicholas finally spots the old wolf, he doesn't issue a military command. He cries, "Ulyulyu." To call this a hunting cry doesn't do justice to the text. It's a phonetic trigger that bypasses the cerebral cortex and hotwires the human nervous system directly to the horse's gallop. His aging, shaggy dog Karay, famous for tackling wolves unaided, throws himself into the gully, pinning the beast by the throat. As Nicholas watches this desperate, choking tangle of gray hair and snapping teeth, he realizes it's the happiest moment of his life. He isn't thinking about the heavily mortgaged ancestral house near Moscow. He isn't thinking about the debts. He's entirely submerged in the brutal, vital present. He means it literally. They face a deeper problem. Their capacity for extreme, unmediated joy mirrors their financial ruin perfectly. You can't maintain the hyper-attuned emotional bandwidth required to experience absolute rapture in a frozen gully while simultaneously possessing the cold, administrative sociopathy required to balance the books of an early 19th century estate. They're bleeding cash precisely because they're the kind of people who take 54 hounds on a hunting trip while the bank prepares to foreclose. You might argue Nicholas knows the stakes, that he came home specifically at his mother's request to fix the critical financial situation. He even beats up the thieving steward to prove he means business. But beating a steward isn't accounting. It's just feudal theater, a performance of authority that changes exactly 0 numbers in the ledger. They lay bare their soul's true currency when he takes Natasha and Petya to Uncle's cabin after the hunt. Uncle isn't a grand nobleman. He's a distant relative of small means living in a little wooden house. But when he picks up a guitar, blows the dust off it, tunes it, and strikes a single sonorous chord to play "Came a Maiden Down the Street," he commands the room entirely. Uncle doesn't play with refined parlor technique. He plays with a relentless, driving physical rhythm that demands participation, snapping the invisible tether between the aristocratic children and their polished Moscow upbringing, until Natasha throws off her shawl and begins to dance with completely unlearned, intuitive precision. Natasha turns to her brother, practically begging him to explain what moves her so deeply, and then she delivers a devastatingly accurate self assessment. She tells her brother she knows she'll never again be as happy and tranquil as she's at that exact moment. She's right. She's peaking at 16 in a minor neighbor's wooden house, sustained by buttermilk cakes and the raw acoustic vibration of a peasant song. Their fatal flaw lies in knowing exact what the best things in life are, since none of those things generate revenue. This identical dynamic plays out during the Christmas mummer's visit to the Melyukovs. They dress up in absurd costumes, painting their faces with burnt cork and riding troika sleighs over the snow. It's in this bizarre theatrical disguise that Nicholas looks at his portionless cousin Sonia with quite new eyes. The ridiculous drawn on mustache breaks his habitual way of seeing her. He runs into the moonlight, intercepts her near the barn, and kisses her on lips that still carry the ashy smell of their performance. He decides he'll marry her. He feels the strength of eternal youth and gladness in his chest. Later that night, the magic curdles into anxiety. The girls sit in front of looking glasses, staring into the receding line of candles, desperate to see a vision of the future. Natasha sees nothing. Sonia, pressured to perform, invents a vision of Prince Andrew lying down, smiling. They're trying to divine their fates in a pair of mirrors because they've entirely surrendered control over their actual lives. The winter magic's exhausted itself, leaving them sitting in the dark, waiting for external forces to rescue them. The hangover arrives the moment they remember they're broke. The Countess, desperate to save the ancestral Rostov house, corners Nicholas with the only viable mathematical solution. He's got to marry Julie Karagina, a wealthy heiress. Here, the text stages a collision between two entirely incompatible moral frameworks. Nicholas refuses. He asks his mother if he's expected to sacrifice my feelings and my honor for the sake of money, just because the girl he loves hasn't got a fortune. Nicholas thinks he's fighting a battle of pure romance against cynical greed. He thinks his devotion to the dowerless Sonia makes him a hero, a martyr for love against the cold calculus of the estate. But the Countess doesn't view the courage in a marriage as a sacrifice demanded of her son. She herself wishes to make a sacrifice for him, tearing apart her own conscience to save his future. In the mother's framework, marrying into money isn't a betrayal of honor. It's the ultimate act of familial preservation. It's the heavy, necessary lifting required to keep the 54 hounds running and the balalaikas playing for the next generation. When Nicholas threatens to marry Sonia secretly, the Countess explodes. She strips away the polite fiction of their shared domestic affection and calls Sonia an intriguer. To call the quiet, intensely devoted Sonia an intriguer isn't just an insult. It's a panicked reclassification of a threat, like a ship's captain looking at a gentle, predictable ocean current and suddenly realizing it's the exact force steadily dragging the hull toward a reef. Sonia's flawless, unalterable love's the very thing that'll bankrupt them. A terrifying logic governs the Rostov household. Their purest moral victories are completely indistinguishable from their financial suicide. The closer they draw to one another in loyalty, the faster they accelerate toward absolute poverty. The math doesn't care. Natasha manages a frantic, incoherent truce between her mother and Nicholas, but the decay's terminal. The townhouse must be sold. They've got to go to Moscow. Natasha's left pacing the rooms, desperately missing her betrothed, Prince Andrew, terrified of growing old and asking why she should be wasted like this. She feels the life bleeding out of her, but she misunderstands the hemorrhage's source. The Rostovs aren't being ruined because they failed to adapt to the economic realities of the 19th century. They're being ruined because they succeeded entirely at being alive. The sheer unthinking velocity that compels Nicholas to hurl his horse down a ravine, and the uncritical warmth that leaves the old count utterly incapable of managing his stewards, aren't merely tragic flaws operating adjacent to their ruin, but the exact and necessary mechanisms actively constructing it. The bankruptcy of the Rostov family isn't a failure of administration. It's the mandatory ransom demanded by the Russian earth for the privilege of possessing a soul. Tolstoy builds an architectural marvel of a human being in Prince Andrew, gives him every ounce of his own aristocratic intellect, and then has his fiancée throw him over for a man who possesses the internal life of a cavalry horse. Anatoly Kuragin doesn't have a philosophy, doesn't harbor secret depths, and operates with a good-humored complacency, making him essentially immune to moral self-reflection. He walks into a Moscow theater, stares at Natasha Rostova without the barrier of modesty she instinctively expects from polite society, and within 3 days she's packing her bags to elope with a man who's already secretly married to someone else entirely. You can read book 8 as a 19th century melodrama, a cautionary tale about a provincial girl getting played by a city predator but the actual mechanics of the sequence are far colder and more precise. Natasha doesn't fall in love with Anatole because she's stupid. She falls into him because she's the ultimate symbol of what the critic DS. Mirsky calls the natural man a creature entirely porous to the concept. Stoy thinks drives the whole universe. Necessity. In Tolstoy's historical framework, necessity isn't destiny in the Greek sense, where the gods write a script and you read the lines. It's the sheer crushing aggregate of a billion tiny, unthinking physical causes pushing you forward, an avalanche of geography and biology making a total mockery of individual agency. Think of a doomed military campaign. The emperor in the capital issues a grand strategic directive, but the actual slaughter happens because 100,000 starving infantrymen react blindly to the smell of French gunpowder, leaving the historians to invent tactical brilliance out of pure chaos. The generals write memoirs claiming they commanded the violence, but, as Tolstoy argues when mapping this out, kings are the slaves of history. Natasha's collapse in the theater is that exact military failure, scaled down to a single nervous system. When she looks at Anatole, she doesn't make a choice. The biological fact of his nearness, the heat of the room, the gaze that bypasses her intellect entirely. These physical inputs consume her free will so rapidly she's left functioning as an automaton of desire, her mind frantically inventing romantic justifications for what her body's already done. Look at the physical prop sealing the betrayal. Anatole doesn't even write his own love letter. His friend Dolokhov drafts it for him. The paper's just a collage of cheap, recycled romantic cliches about stealing her away to the ends of the earth. But when Natasha reads it, she doesn't parse the syntax. She reads it 20 times and finds deep meaning in each word of it because her nervous system requires the letter to be a masterpiece. The text isn't functioning as communication, it's functioning as a chemical catalyst. She decides she loves him, or rather, she realizes her body's already made the decision, and she retroactively assigns the word love to the sheer panic of being overpowered. The sharpest objection to this deterministic nightmare comes from inside the novel itself, courtesy of the man she betrays. Prince Andrew represents the absolute peak of self-conscious, rational control. When Pierre Bezukhov tries to broker a peace, Andrew shuts him down with the icy logic of someone refusing to let biology operate as an excuse for cruelty. A fallen woman should be forgiven, Andrew tells him, but I didn't say I could forgive her. This isn't just a jilted lover's wounded pride. It's a furious philosophical protest against Tolstoy's entire worldview. If we're just meat responding to proximity and heat, if we're entirely held captive by necessity, then morality's a joke and the concept of forgiveness is incoherent. Andrew insists on holding the line for free will, and he breaks his own heart to do it. He hands Pierre her letters and her portrait, smiling maliciously, entirely locked inside the prison of his own pristine principles. He'd rather lose his future than admit the human animal is driven by forces it can't control. Pierre's suffocating. His wife's back in Moscow, securing favors, securing favors from important personages, and the revulsion he feels toward his own marriage has triggered a severe spiritual relapse. The text tells us his malady that had formerly found expression in such acute attacks was driven inwards. He's dragging himself through Moscow society, trying to avoid looking at the utter emptiness of human ambition, trying to ignore what he calls that dreadful it. The void of meaninglessness waiting at the bottom of every political debate, every hand of cards, and every aristocratic marriage. He abandons his Masonic diary. He haunts the English club. He drinks heavily and reads compulsively, treating society the way entrenched soldiers treat meaningless, busy work under artillery fire, doing absolutely anything to distract himself from the terrifying silence of his own head. When Maria Dmitrievna summons him to deal with the Kuragin fallout, Pierre goes to the house expecting to exercise righteous contempt. He's armed with the facts. He knows Anatol's a scoundrel, and he knows Natasha's acted with raw cruelty. He intends to deliver the moral verdict of the rational world. Instead, the exact opposite happens. The moment he sees her crying, the rationalist machinery falls apart. He doesn't decide to forgive her. The pity simply bypasses his brain, rewiring his vocal cords before he can stop himself. He blurts out that if he weren't tied to his own disastrous wife, he'd drop to his knees that very moment and beg for her hand. He fails to be a moral judge because he gets hijacked by the very same raw, unthinking vitality that just ruined Natasha's life. He surrenders to the irrational forces of existence, realizing the intellect's just a passenger, falsely believing it's holding the steering wheel. It makes total sense that Ivan Turgenev initially threw the book aside, calling it positively bad, boring, and unsuccessful. When you're trained on novels where protagonists learn coherent lessons and execute deliberate choices, watching Tolstoy's people get batted around by their own biochemical impulses feels like a structural cheat. But the critic N. Strakov recognized the underlying architecture, defending the novel as a complete picture of humanity, precisely because it admits we aren't driving the car. When Pierre walks out into the freezing Moscow night and stares up at the comet of 1812, he isn't having a moral epiphany about how to fix his broken marriage, and he isn't formulating a political strategy to save a nation on the brink of a brutal war. He's just watching a dirty chunk of ice obey the laws of physics and feeling jealous of it. The central claim of Book 8 isn't that love makes you foolish or that society's corrupt. It's that the only way to survive the crushing machinery of the universe is to stop pretending you aren't a gear inside it. A 15-year-old boy stands in a breathless, crushing crowd below a balcony in Moscow, watching the Tsar finish his dinner. A largish piece of biscuit breaks off in the emperor's hand and falls to the parapet, then to the ground. A coachman lunges for it. The crowd swarms, and suddenly the boy springs forward, upsetting an old woman, pushing her hand away from his knee to seize the pastry crumbs, screaming himself hoarse with devotion. He doesn't know why he needs the crumb, only that he must have it and that he can't give way. This isn't a quaint historical anecdote about imperial fervor. It's the exact mechanical blueprint for how millions of men ended up marching eastward to burn Europe to the ground. Tolstoy insists that on the 12th of June, 1812, when the forces of Western Europe crossed the Russian frontier, an event took place opposed to human reason and to human nature. The standard historical reflex is to look for a mastermind, to blame the diplomatic friction over the continental system or the insults inflicted on the Duke of Oldenburg. Tolstoy demands we discard this. He forces us to fall back on fatalism as an explanation of irrational events, dividing human existence into two strict registers. There's the conscious life, where you choose whether to drink tea or play a hand of cards, and then there's the elemental hive life, where every action you perform is instantly absorbed into an irrevocable, predestined historical mass. When the text calls us to observe this elemental hive life, it isn't speaking in vague, poetic registers about the interconnectedness of man. It's a rigid, structural inevitability where individual consciousness is completely blind to its own aggregate effects, much like a single water molecule boiling in a kettle feels only its own agitation, utterly unaware that it's contributing to the pressure that'll blow the lid off the metal pot. Man lives for himself, but the moment he acts, he serves as an unconscious instrument in the attainment of the historic, universal aims of humanity. Because we can't perceive the kettle, we invent narratives about the steam. We look at the absolute carnage of 1812, the thefts, forgeries, and murders that millions of men perpetrated against one another without viewing them as crimes. And we point to a French emperor smelling of eau de cologne. Napoleon struts through the captured Russian quarters in Vilna, pulling a 40-year-old Russian general by the ear, supremely convinced that the world depends entirely on his will. Tolstoy looks at this posture and diagnoses it as an optical illusion. In historic events, The so-called great men are labels giving names to events. And like tags tied to a piece of luggage, they have the smallest possible connection to the actual movement of the object. Prince Andrew watches this delusion play out in miniature at the Drissa camp, listening to a pedantic German military theoretician named Fuel bitterly defend an intricate, scientifically perfect battle plan that completely ignores the uncontrollable, chaotic reality of men hacking at each other in the mud. Fuel represents the ultimate hubris of the conscious mind, insisting that war can be mapped on a drafting table, whereas Prince Andrew realizes that success never belongs to the strategists, but depends entirely on the random man in the ranks who inexplicably shouts, "We are lost!" or "Hurrah!" at the pivotal moment. There's no science of war. Nicholas Rostov proves this on the battlefield at Ostrovna. He sits in the rain, bored by the talk of his fellow officers, and later, without orders and without any grand patriotic thought, he charges a line of French dragoons. He doesn't do it out of strategic calculation or a noble desire to defend his nation, but because he has a keen sportsman's eye, and the sight of the fleeing Frenchmen triggers the exact same predatory instinct that makes him gallop across the path of a fleeing wolf. He knocks an enemy officer off his horse, watches the terrified, young, dimpled Frenchman hop on one foot, tangled in a stirrup, and he's suddenly handed a George's cross. He's nauseated by his own commendation. He realizes that what the state calls heroism's just a panicked biological reflex wrapped in a flag. The enemy wasn't a monster. He was just a frightened boy with blue eyes, and Rostov's hand trembled. The individual will to commit violence is entirely absent. Yet the hive requires the violence to occur. So the hive rewards the wolf hunting instinct as if it were a moral virtue, while the men bleed on the frontier. Nasha Rostova tries to claw back her own agency through spiritual exhaustion. She starves herself, wakes at 3 in the morning to pray with a country neighbor, and seeks the happiness of forgiving and of being forgiven. She's desperately trying to believe that her individual moral choices, her disastrous romance with Kuragin, her relentless remorse, actually matter. She wants to be entirely in control of her own ruin and redemption. But the tragedy of Natasha's fasting is the same tragedy as Napoleon's posturing. She's entirely subservient to the physical, elemental reality of her own youth. Despite the pills and the prayers, her body simply begins to recover physically. The hive life of her own biology overrules her conscious desire to remain in mourning. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Pierre Bezukhov tries to decode the invasion through an apocalyptic parlor trick. He translates the letters of his own name, L'Rus Besukhov, into numbers, adding them up to 666 to convince himself he's uniquely predestined to set a limit to the power of the beast. Pierre's desperate to find a rational mathematical script for the madness, an equation that'll give his personal choices cosmic weight. But the script doesn't exist, and the forces of history don't care about his numerology any more than they care about the emperor's tact. What's the cost of this worldview? If we accept Tolstoy's premise that every act is predestined from eternity, and that millions of men committing unprecedented burglaries and murders are merely functioning as unconscious instruments of the hive, the mechanism of moral responsibility entirely vanishes. If the man who orders an army across a continent is nothing but a decorative label attached to an inevitable swarm, and the boy who slaughters a retreating soldier is acting on an innocent mammalian reflex, then the concept of guilt itself becomes a mathematical impossibility. The text demands we forgive the violence because the perpetrators are merely unthinking tools, but it demands we forgive them by erasing the very agency that makes forgiveness meaningful. We're left with a vast, blameless machine where burning a city to ash is structurally indistinguishable from a 15-year-old boy shoving an old woman into the dirt to snatch a pastry crumb. When military historians claim that the French failed to win at Borodino because Napoleon caught a cold, they're committing a category error so fundamental that it forces Tolstoy to rewrite the entire mechanism of human agency. If history actually hinged on the emperor's sinuses, that means the valet who omitted to bring Napoleon his waterproof boots was the true savior of Russia. But history doesn't work like that. On the eve of the battle, Napoleon receives a portrait of his son, the King of Rome, brought by Monsieur de Beausset. He poses in front of it, demanding it be taken away because the boy's too young to see a battlefield performing the role of Europe's master. Yet Tolstoy observes that the men fighting the war imagine they act of their own free will while they're actually involuntary tools of history. Napoleon's genius didn't direct the battle. None of his orders survived execution because in the chaos of a front line, noise swallows the commands before they reach a single lieutenant. He's merely riding it. By stripping the emperor of his agency, Tolstoy insists that the man dictating orders from the Shevardino redoubts nothing more than a figurehead riding a tidal wave of inevitability, functioning perfectly only because he doesn't realize the smoke swallows his commands. This collapse of individual will doesn't just happen at the top of the military hierarchy. It fractures the entire Russian social order. Back at the Bolkonski estate, the old Prince Nicholas clings to the illusion that he controls his domain right up until the French approach induces a fatal stroke. Napoleon sweeps him aside, as Prince Andrew later bitterly realizes, exactly as one might brush a chip from his path. Princess Mary, trapped at Bogucharovo, finds the very fabric of her reality dissolved. Her father's dead, and the peasants, led by the village elder Drawn and the agitator Carp, refuse to provide horses for her escape. The peasants aren't staging a calculated political revolution. They're infected by the same chaotic, intangible current sweeping across the continent. When young Rostov arrives with a handful of hussars and subdues the rebellion with a few shouts and shoves, it isn't because he possesses superior tactical genius. It's because he steps into the exact psychological shape of a master at the exact moment the peasant's collective nerve wavers. He acts involuntarily, driven by an unthinking aristocratic reflex, and the peasants submit just as involuntarily. Kutuzov's the only commander who understands that authority's mostly a theatrical performance. You've got the Russian chief of staff, Bennigsen, and adjutants like Wolzogen running around trying to impose geometric logic on a meat grinder. Wolzogen gallops up to report the left flank's broken and the troops fled. Kutuzov doesn't adjust his tactical map. He rejects the report entirely, choking with rage, and orders a counterattack for the next day. The facts don't matter. Kutuzov despises cleverness and knowledge because he recognizes that an intangible force governs a battle, something that can't be charted on a grid. His only weapons, as he tells Prince Andrew, are patience and time. If you try to surgically extract a sickness from a body, you only kill the patient faster. Kutuzov prefers to lock the doors and let the fever burn itself out, knowing the room's internal temperature's the only thing that can do the actual killing. He sits on a rug-covered bench, dozing off, validating the spirit of the army rather than micromanaging its artillery. That spirit's exactly what Pierre Bezukhov unwittingly walks into. Pierre's a civilian who wanders onto the battlefield in a white hat and green swallowtail coat, looking for something to see. He stumbles into the Knoll Battery, later known as Raevski's Redoubt, where tens of thousands of men face slaughter. He thinks it's an insignificant position. Instead of panicking, he notices a weird, bantering liveliness among the doomed gunners. Prince Andrew explained this to Pierre the night before. Success in war doesn't depend on position or equipment or numbers. It depends on a feeling. Tolstoy calls this the latent heat of patriotism. In thermodynamics, latent heat's the energy required to change a substance's physical state from water to steam without altering its temperature. For Tolstoy, it's the invisible moral energy required to convert a terrified peasant into a willing corpse without changing his outward composure. It's an unseen fuel making men indifferent to their own destruction, causing them to treat an incoming artillery shell as a joke right up until it tears them apart. The reality of that destruction hits Andrew entirely by accident. Earlier in the retreat, he looks at a muddy pond full of bathing soldiers, laughing and splashing, and feels a sudden wave of disgust at the sheer volume of vulnerable human material, reducing them to flesh, bodies, cannon fodder. Then a spinning shell lands near him in a meadow. He doesn't want to die. He loves the grass and the air, but he hesitates because he knows his men watch him. A fragment tears into his abdomen. In the dressing tent, surrounded by the moans of naked, bleeding men, Andrew finds himself on a table next to Anatoly Kuragin, the man who ruined Andrew's chance at happiness with Natasha. Anatol's sobbing as doctors amputate his plump, white leg, staring at the severed limb of his greatest enemy. Prince Andrew finally grasps the divine love his sister preached, realizing that the petty romantic grievances of his past dissolve entirely under the shared grotesque vulnerability of being meat on a table. The animosity evaporates. Ecstatic pity's all that remains. Because the Russians stand willing to be meat, they achieve the only outcome that actually shifts the war's axis. They don't win the ground. The French capture the redoubts, and the Russian armies bled half to death. But Borodino's a moral victory. That isn't the kind of victory defined by capturing wooden standards or occupying a specific field. It's a victory forcing a massively superior invading army to look at its opponent and suddenly recognize its own impotence. And that's the only victory that matters. But there's a brutal cost to the architecture of Tolstoy's argument, and the text never manages to square the ledger. We're asked to accept that every man on that field acts as an involuntary tool of history, driven by an inexorable macro force rendering individual choices completely meaningless. If that's true, then Andrew's sudden, weeping forgiveness of Anatole isn't a moral triumph at all. Tolstoy demands we view the violent collision of two massive armies as a predetermined natural disaster. But by doing so, he accidentally strips the spiritual weight from his own character's internal transformations, reducing Prince Andrew's ultimate act of forgiveness to just another biochemical reaction inside a dying organism. If the French soldiers slaughtering Russians act merely as falling rocks in an inescapable historical landslide, then the Russian soldiers' choice to forgive them can't be a choice either. The intangible force dictating who wins the battle must also be dictating who achieves spiritual grace. We're left with a determinism so absolute that it does exactly what the author wanted it to do to the generals while doing something he never intended to his heroes. It doesn't just excuse the murderers, it annihilates the saints. The entire French army doesn't actually conquer Moscow so much as it dissolves into it. They march through the gates as a terrifying, disciplined military machine, but within hours, the troops behave exactly like water percolating through sand. Is absolutely beautiful. Before the commanders can even assign them quarters, the soldiers realize there's no one left to stop them, and the vast imperial force immediately fractures into isolated units of greed. They flow into the deserted, wealthy houses and cease to be an army entirely, becoming instead a mob of marauders whose only remaining objectives to keep whatever valuables they can carry. Napoleon, meanwhile, stands on Poklony Hill, waiting for a deputation of boyars to surrender their ancient capital, carefully composing a speech full of clemency and majestic dignity, completely unawares that the city below him's already a queenless hive entirely emptied of the very people he expects to dominate. Tolstoy flatly repudiates the idea that the actions of some one man, a king or a commander, are equivalent to the sum of many individual wills. The orthodox reading of history assumes that massive populations move because a genius at the top pulls a lever. Tolstoy counters that the lever only moves when the people have already organically shifted their weight. When the wealthy is absolutely beautiful, when the wealthy citizens of Moscow pack up their wagons and flee, abandoning their homes and half their belongings, they aren't obeying a municipal evacuation order or following the frantic broadsheets printed by the government. They're exercising a latent patriotism that expresses itself not by dramatic phrases or unnatural exploits, but unobtrusively, simply, organically. Think of a massive flock of starlings turning abruptly in the evening sky. There's no lead bird issuing a command, no general directing the maneuver, just an immediate, localized reaction to an atmospheric pressure drop that scales up instantly into a massive geographical shift. The citizens leave because remaining under occupation's fundamentally incompatible with being Russian. This creates a brutal paradox about the subsequent burning of the city. Tolstoy claims that Moscow was burned by its inhabitants. It's true, but by the inhabitants who abandoned it, not the ones who stayed. You can't explain the destruction of a sprawling metropolis by hunting for a specific French arsonist or a specific Russian patriot, because the fire's simply the mathematical certainty of leaving thousands of careless strangers alone with cooking pots in a city made of timber. As the text insists, deserted Moscow had to burn as inevitably as a heap of shavings has to burn on which sparks continually fall for several days. There was no mastermind. There was only friction and physics. There's a deep unbridgeable divide here between the people who accept this lack of individual control and the people who violently reject it. Kutuzov knew the game. He sits by the Yauza Bridge, dejected and frowning, refusing to give battle because he understands that the collective momentum of the Russian retreat couldn't be reversed by a tactical whim. He orders the retreat not to deceive anyone, but because he recognizes the physical reality of a bleeding, mortally wounded army that needs to lick its wounds. Count Rostopchin, the military governor of Moscow, sits at the exact opposite end of the delusion. Rostopchin actually believes he's the one authoring the event because he possesses a sanguine and impulsive temperament. He only knows intellectually that the city's lost. He hasn't adapted to it in his heart. When reality violently intrudes, when he's suddenly stuck with the state property he failed to evacuate, and a furious crowd gathers in his courtyard demanding a traitor, he panics. He needs a scapegoat to resolve the unbearable dissonance between his supposed absolute authority and his actual total impotence. So he drags out a half-starved political prisoner named Vereshchagin and feeds him to the mob. That's the anatomy of a massacre. Rostopchin watches the dragoons and the frenzied crowd hack this weeping young man to pieces, and as soon as the physical danger of the mobs behind him, his mind desperately seeks equilibrium. He rationalizes the murder by invoking le bien public. It's the psychological equivalent of a carbon offset, a completely abstract accounting trick that allows you to commit a localized atrocity right now by projecting a massive, unprovable benefit into a distant future. As the text notes, since men began killing one another, no one's ever committed such a crime without comforting himself with this same idea of the hypothetical welfare of other people. Rostopchin didn't kill a man to save Moscow. He killed a man to anesthetize his own ego against the realization that he was entirely irrelevant to the fall of the city. Pierre Bezukhov makes the exact same cognitive error, just inverted. Pierre looks at the sheer chaos of the French invasion and decides that he, personally, is uniquely predestined to assassinate Napoleon. He even calculates the Kabbalistic significance of his own name to prove to himself that his individual existence is the key to ending the misery of Europe. He drops into a state bordering on insanity, where he's entirely absorbed by his self-appointed role as Europe's savior, tortured not by the logistical impossibility of assassinating an emperor, but by the dread that he might lose his nerve and forfeit his own self-esteem. He procures a peasant's coat, arms himself with a dagger, and hides in the burning city. It was a delusion. The grand world historical narrative Pierre tries to write for himself can't survive actual human proximity. Instead of pulling the trigger, he saves the life of a French officer named Captain Ramballe, gets drunk on his enemy's wine, spills his own agonizing marital history, and then wanders out the next morning to rescue a crying child and brawl with looters over a stolen necklace. Pierre's sweeping historical agency dissolves instantly into chaotic biological reactions to the people standing right in front of him. When he actually encounters the enemy, he doesn't strike a blow for Russia. He throws a punch because a tall marauder in a frieze gown's choking a young Armenian woman. The grand scale's always a fiction. Only the micro interactions are real. You see this exact same surrender to the immediate over the strategic when the Rostov family packs to flee. The old count and Natasha don't hesitate to unload their incredibly valuable property. 100,000 rubles worth of goods just to give up their carts to the wounded soldiers outside. Natasha doesn't do it out of a calculated patriotic program. She does it with the spontaneous, absolute ardor characteristic of all her actions, recognizing instantly that preserving a chiffonnier while men bleed to death in the yards a grotesque violation of human necessity. The only character who fully grasps the illusion of control's the one actively dying. Prince Andrew, lying in a dark hut with an inflamed, mortifying bowel wound, realizes that his entire life's been animated by the wrong mechanism. He used to love Natasha with a human love, which requires a specific object, a specific reason, and can easily curdle into hatred or jealousy when the object acts independently. Now, stripped of his future and his physical agency, he accesses what he calls a divine love. This isn't a soft, sentimental warmth. It's a terrifying structural detachment. Divine love doesn't require an object, can't be destroyed by death, and allows you to love your enemy simply because they exist as part of the same necessary, determined fabric you do. That's the final, unforgiving turn of the logic. If you take the premise seriously, the great man theory isn't just bad historiography. It's a moral disease. Individual will's the cheapest fiction we have. You don't make history. History makes you, and the only choice you get, whether to accept your reduction to a tiny, determined fraction of the whole, or to scream orders at a mob while you butcher a harmless man on your front steps. Tolstoy's central joke about the apocalypse is that nobody actually has the decency to notice it happening. While Moscow burns to the ground and the Russian army bleeds out at Borodino, the highest echelons of Petersburg society are utterly consumed by the logistical inconvenience of Countess Bezukhova accidentally marrying two men at the same time and dying from a botched medical attempt to fix the paperwork. You expect the collapse of a nation's ancient capital to tear the sky open, but Tolstoy refuses to give you the satisfaction of a shared historical trauma, insisting instead that the calm, luxurious life of the elite goes right on operating among phantoms and reflections of real life, demanding a massive effort of will just to remember that a war is taking place outside the drawing room. The people actually touching the war aren't reacting to the historical scale of it either, but for an entirely different reason. Nicholas Rostov rides into Voronezh to buy remounts for his hussars. Here's the third-hand reports that his entire Moscow inheritance is likely ash, and simply feels annoyed. The destruction of his city doesn't radicalize him. It just makes his horse buying errand feel dull, replacing whatever patriotic fervor he's supposed to possess with a vague, buzzing awkwardness that he desperately cures by flirting with a blonde woman at a provincial party. He leans into the wine and the social machinery because the geopolitical reality is too abstract to process. He yields entirely to the current of whatever immediate social pressure surrounds him, feeling at the bottom of his heart that giving up his agency to a wealthy aunt's matchmaking scheme is somehow the most important thing he has ever done. He literally praises God for a letter that frees him to abandon his cousin, framing his own romantic convenience as a divine intervention. But it's Sonia who proves how ruthlessly the private obliterates the historical. Sonia has spent her entire life surviving on the charity of the Rostovs, cultivating a meticulous habit of self-sacrifice, because martyrdom is the only currency a poor ward has to buy her own dignity. When the old countess explicitly demands that she break her engagement to Nicholas so he can marry a wealthy heiress and save the family from the financial ruin brought by the French invasion, Sonia is finally forced to sacrifice the exact outcome her entire career of self-denial was designed to secure, and her internal moral machinery abruptly, violently snaps. She suddenly feels a bitter, passionate hatred for her benefactors, realizing with terrifying clarity that her virtue was never pure and that her quiet love is rapidly mutating into a fierce possessiveness entirely unconcerned with principle or religion. When she learns Natasha is nursing the wounded Prince Andrew, Sonia calculates that if they reconcile, the prohibited degrees of affinity will legally bar Nicholas from marrying Andrew's sister. She uses the chaos of a national retreat to secure her romantic monopoly, binding Nicholas to her under the guise of releasing him. Even Princess Mary, arriving in Yaroslav, convinced she is executing a purely spiritual duty, finds her carefully constructed morality fracturing on impact. She believes she has finally achieved peace by stifling her personal dreams, neatly splitting the difference so she can be happy in her secret love for Nicholas, while giving full play to her grief for her dying brother. But this compartmentalized peace is obliterated the second she steps out of her carriage. She looks at Sonia, the girl whose existence blocks her own future, and feels an immediate choking hostility. She looks at Natasha, the woman who ruined her brother's life, and instead of righteous anger, she feels a sudden, overwhelming comrade's love weeping on the shoulder of the girl she used to despise. The war hasn't purified anyone. It has just accelerated their contradictions, stripping away the polite fictions they use to govern their behavior. This is what happens to the people who still want things to turn out well. Tolstoy reserves a far stranger geometry for the people whose internal worlds actually collapse. Pierre watches the French execute innocent men, and the mainspring of his life is simply wrenched out, reducing his faith in the right ordering of the universe, in humanity, and in his own soul to a heap of meaningless rubbish. His collapse is total. He isn't merely sad. He is sitting silent and motionless on a heap of straw, physically unable to regain faith in the meaning of life because he has seen the mechanics of murder up close, committed by soldiers who clearly didn't wish to commit it. The executioners were just as trapped by the system as the victims, which means there's no localized evil to fight, only a vast, indifferent machine grinding everyone down. The factory lad's terrified face in the smoke breaks, the entire conceptual framework Pierre has spent years building. He doesn't reconstruct his philosophy through rigorous deduction. He has it casually handed back to him by a peasant who smells strongly of sweat, is cheerfully taking off his leg bands in the dark, and mutters, "Lay me down like a stone, O God, and raise me up like a loaf." Platon Kuratayev is introduced as an unfathomable, rounded, eternal personification of the spirit of simplicity. That roundness isn't just a physical descriptor. It's the exact topological shape of his soul. Think of a drop of mercury rolling across an inclined pane of glass, reflecting every face that leans over it perfectly, yet never absorbing the dirt in its path, never losing its absolute spherical tension, and never leaving a trace of itself behind when it slides off the edge. Platon loves his dog, the French who captured him, and Pierre exactly equally, precisely because he refuses to form the kind of jagged, asymmetrical attachments that leave a person broken when the object of affection is removed. His affection is universal. It's entirely impersonal. Pierre realizes with a jolt that this man who just saved his sanity wouldn't grieve for a single second if they were parted forever. The final destination of this trajectory isn't survival, but rather Prince Andrew, who demonstrates the actual cost of discarding your illusions. Andrew is dying, but his dying isn't a medical failure. It's a cognitive achievement. He experiences an aloofness from everything earthly and a strange and joyous lightness of existence, which is exactly what happens when you finally stop trying to force the universe to conform to human scale. When Princess Mary arrives, desperate to mourn him, she expects the tender brother she knew, but instead encounters a gaze that looks entirely inward, completely indifferent to the living people standing around his bed, projecting a cold alienation that strikes horror into her heart. Andrew attempts to tether himself to life by reasoning that love hinders death, arguing that love is the organizing principle of everything that exists, and that to die is merely to return to the eternal source. But this is just a rhetorical trick his biological body is playing on him. He falls asleep. He dreams he is in his room, whole and healthy, but a terrible, absolute necessity is pushing against the door. He tries to lock it against the encroaching void, frantically attempting to push the bolt home before the threat can breach the threshold, but his paralyzed legs refuse to move. His superhuman efforts prove entirely useless, and the two halves of the door noiselessly yield to let the darkness through. It entered, and it was death, and Prince Andrew died. And then, in the very same instant, he wakes up. He doesn't wake up in the room. He wakes up to the realization that death is an awakening, and that life itself was the dream, a temporary fever of attachments, political allegiances, and private griefs that only matter if you're asleep. He didn't die because his physical wounds finally gangrened. He died because he realized that clinging to a single woman, a single nation, or a single version of the future was a localized sickness. And the moment his mind finally grasped the vast, impersonal necessity of the universe, there was no longer any reason to keep breathing. Picture a clock face hanging on a wall, utterly separated from its internal gears, where an emperor is furiously spinning the minute hand with his finger, dictating flawless administrative commands to the empty air, and entirely failing to realize that the chimes he expects to hear will never actually sound. That's Napoleon in Moscow. He enters the ancient capital after what the historians call a brilliant victory, holding incalculable wealth and provisions, and he proceeds to issue entirely rational orders. He dictates a proclamation to the artisans to return to work. He establishes a municipal government to stop the robberies. He distributes paper money to the unfortunate, and he confidently assumes these livers are still connected to the material world, completely missing that the actual machine is totally dead. Tolstoy notes they aren't. They merely act like the hands of a clock detached from the mechanism, swinging aimlessly in an arbitrary direction without engaging the cogwheels of reality. The peasants catch the commissaries who bring the proclamations and kill them. The French troops, collecting booty, care only for gold and ignore the paper money. When you look at a structural failure, this absolute, the reflex is to search for a tactical error. The French historians dissect Napoleon's choices, wondering why he didn't march on Petersburg or retire by a more northerly route, insisting that the greatest of all military geniuses simply made a ruinous mistake. But the mistake is assuming the genius was driving the car. Imagine a child sitting in the passenger seat of a runaway wagon, tightly gripping a pair of loose strings he found on the floorboards, pulling them left and right, and fiercely believing he's steering the vehicle as it plunges down a ravine. That's the extent of Napoleon's agency during the retreat. The Russian flanking movement to the Kaluga Road and the Battle of Tarutino weren't the results of military foresight or careful planning. They were the inevitable, convulsive adjustments of a theater of war settling into a new equilibrium. The French army wasn't outmaneuvered. It was collapsing from the inside, devolving into a wounded animal which feels it is perishing and does not know what it is doing. To study the skillful tactics of Napoleon at this stage is like studying the dying leaps and shudders of that mortally wounded animal. It isn't a military force anymore. It's a herd of cattle trampling the provender that might have saved it. When the flight along the Smolensk road begins, the retreat isn't a strategic withdrawal governed by a commander's will. It's a physical law of gravity drawing individual human atoms to itself. Hundreds of thousands of men are bound together not by discipline, but by the gravitational pull of their own mass and a shared, desperate instinct to flee. The historians love to populate this collapse with master tacticians, but Tolstoy explicitly mocks this reflex. When the Russian army needs to send someone to Forminsk to handle the unglamorous reality of the French vanguard, they don't send one of the celebrated heroes. They send Dokhturov. He's a modest, undiscerning little man whom nobody writes poems about, who never draws up grand plans of battle, and who's completely ignored by the official record. His silence in the history books is the clearest testimony to his merit. Dokhturov doesn't try to impose a grand narrative on the war. He just stands where the position is most difficult and absorbs the impact. The men who actually matter in a deterministic universe are the ones who don't pretend they're authoring it. This brings us to a fundamental disagreement about how history actually operates, staged right in the middle of the Russian high command. On one side, you have the aggressive staff generals, Ermolov, Miloradovich, Platov, and Bennigsen. The aggressive staff generals think war is a theater where bold tactical strikes win the board. So they mock Kutuzov's refusal to fight, literally sending him a blank sheet of paper in an envelope to protest his inaction while demanding they sacrifice thousands of Russian lives just to bar a road. The French are already fleeing down. They want to cut off, to seize, to overthrow. On the other side, you have Kutuzov, the old commander in chief, lying on his bed in the dark, with his one seeing eye open, resting his heavy, scarred head on his plump hand. Kutuzov knows the beast is wounded. He knows the enemy is melting away on the road from Moscow to Vyazma without any battle at all. Why fight? Why lose your own men to slaughter unfortunate wretches when the enemy's destruction is mathematically assured? The boulder is already falling. Kutuzov understands that when the physical law of gravity is doing your work for you, adding a bayonet charge is just a vanity project. He tells himself that patience and time are my warriors, my champions. He spends all his limited power trying to restrain his troops from useless encounters. The cost of ignoring this reality is brutally literal. When the Cossacks have a chance to capture Napoleon himself, they fall upon the booty instead, entirely disregarding the emperor to loot the baggage trains, allowing him to escape. The French army is destroyed by its own plunder, carrying stolen furs and icons until they starve under the weight. The men trying to command this chaos, both the French generals trying to stop the flight and the Russian generals trying to intercept it, are equally delusional. The only figures who actually navigate this world successfully are the ones who stop trying to dictate its terms, which is why Pierre Bezukhov's experience in The Prisoner sheds matters. Pierre spent his entire life trying to engineer inner harmony through external frameworks. He tried philanthropy, Freemasonry, dissipations of town life, heroic feats of self-sacrifice, and Kabbalistic calculations of the beast of the apocalypse. All of these were attempts to spin the detached clock hands, forcing the world to align with his moral ambitions. They all failed. Now, he's a prisoner of war. He wears a dirty, torn shirt, a pair of soldier's trousers tied with string round the ankles, and a peasant coat. His feet were bare. Right now, at the extreme limits of privation, stripped of his name and his wealth, he finds the complete peace of mind he sought for decades. He finds it precisely because the horror of death has washed away the agitating thoughts that formerly seemed so important. He realizes the external world of marching armies and burning cities is operating on a completely separate axis from his own soul, and he consoles himself by repeating the peasant Karataev's phrase that Russia and summer weather are not bound together. decisively severing his internal equilibrium from the empire's blazing collapse. When the French drums begin their sharp rattle to force the prisoners onto the road, the doors slam shut and the shedding of blood resumes. Pierre recognizes the sound of the drums as the voice of that mysterious, callous force which compels people against their will to kill their fellow men. He saw it at the executions. He sees it now in the changed, hostile faces of his French captors. It's a fatal, mechanical momentum that crushes everything in its path. But he no longer tries to stand in front of it and shout it down. He doesn't calculate the apocalypse. He doesn't reason with the guards. The fatal force controls his physical existence. But in proportion to its efforts to crush him, there grows in his soul a power of life independent of it. He doesn't transcend the machinery of history by seizing the controls. He survives it by finally admitting that no one is driving the carriage. Petya Rostov sits on the edge of a wagon in the autumn dark, listening to a Cossack sharpen a saber that has never seen combat. And as the steel hisses against the whetstone, this 16-year-old boy begins to hallucinate an immense, triumphant symphony rising from the friction of the blade, in convincing himself he's about to become a hero in a rational military maneuver. He dies at dawn in the mud. This opening scene's the entirety of Tolstoy's argument regarding the French retreat from Moscow in miniature. You've got a human being imposing a beautiful, coherent narrative onto a process that's actually just blunt, mechanical slaughter. Tolstoy spends book 14 treating military historians with absolute contempt because they insist on reading the 1812 campaign as a chess match played by geniuses. The standard historical views that the Russian army under Kutuzov executed a brilliant strategy of flanking maneuvers to corner Napoleon, while Napoleon made a series of tragic tactical errors. Tolstoy looks at the exact same events, sees a half-starved French mob fleeing toward the border while a freezing Russian mob chases them, and declares that trying to force a tactical framework onto this collapse is a willful lie. Military science assumes an army's force is a product of its numbers and its geometric arrangement. The tacticians operate on the rigid rule that an attacking army should act in concentrated masses, while a retreating army should scatter into smaller groups to defend itself. But Tolstoy points out that during the retreat from Moscow, the exact opposite happened. The French congregated into a dense, panicked mass, while the Russians split into small, irregular partisan units that tore them apart. The tacticians are baffled because they're missing the central variable a variable Tolstoy calls the spirit of the army, which he defines as the greater or lesser readiness to fight and face danger felt by all the men. Trying to predict the outcome of a battle based solely on troop formations is like trying to calculate the explosive yield of a chemical reaction by carefully measuring the geometric shape of the glass beaker while stubbornly refusing to check the temperature of the liquid inside, guaranteeing your math will fail the moment the fluid boils. The geometry of the container doesn't matter when the fluid vaporizes. When the spirit of the army drops, the men clump together for psychological warmth. When it rises, they scatter because they no longer need the physical mass to enforce their discipline. This thermodynamic reality produced a phenomenon that broke all European rules of engagement: the emergence of partisan warfare. The Russian government didn't plan it. It started spontaneously when peasants and Cossacks began killing French stragglers as instinctively as dogs worry a stray mad dog to death. It operated entirely outside the bounds of military science. Tolstoy describes it as a terrible cudgel that rose and fell with unthinking necessity, ignoring the elegant fencing foils of traditional warfare. The irregulars didn't outmaneuver anyone. They merely gathered the fallen leaves that dropped of themselves from that withered tree. We see the ugly truth of this warfare in the courtyard before the ambush. Denisov still clings to the honorable rules of combat, wanting to take prisoners and give receipts for them. He even pities the captured French drummer boy, Vincent Bose, bringing him inside to eat mutton, Dolokhov, who actually understands the brutal mechanics of what they're doing, advocates shooting the prisoners on the spot, mocking the idea of dragging corpses around the countryside. The partisan war doesn't have room for Denisov's chivalry or Petya's symphonies. It's an extermination it's an extermination campaign driven by an aggregate biological urge to rid the land of a foreign body. And Dolokhov's cold, glassy-eyed accounting of the dead is the only honest response to it. The historians insist the Russian High Command's aim was to intercept and capture Napoleon's forces. Tolstoy asks a very simple question. If the aim was to cut off the French, and the Russians had superior numbers surrounding them, why didn't they do it? The historians claim the plan was thwarted by bad luck. Tolstoy replies that the plan never existed outside the imaginations of a dozen men sitting in warm rooms, sketching lines on maps that had no bearing on the dirt outside. One can cut off a slice of bread, but not an army. The plan was a fiction. Cutting off an army is physically impossible when there's unlimited space to run and the cover of night. The Russian army's true function wasn't a net. It was a psychological threat. Tolstoy compares the Russian forces to a whip held over a running animal. The experienced driver knows that if the horse is already fleeing, you don't strike it on the head and risk confusing its momentum. You keep the whip raised as a menace, so the animal runs itself to death. The French destroyed themselves. They weren't outmaneuvered. They collapsed under the friction of their own flight. We see this exact friction stripping away human agency in The Captivity of Pierre Bezukhov. Pierre's marching with the French, starving, his feet raw and covered in scabs, surrounded by guards who shoot anyone lagging behind. He watches his friend Karatayev die of fever. The romantic version of this story has Pierre staging a daring escape or intervening to save Karatayev's life. Instead, Pierre keeps his distance. He avoids the smell of the dying man. When he hears the gunshot that ends Karatayev's life, Pierre simply keeps walking, absorbed in a calculation of how many days remain until they reach Smolensk. The old Pierre, the man who tried to assassinate Napoleon to save Europe, would have died trying to wrestle the gun from the French guard. This new Pierre survives because he realizes the individual ego doesn't matter, and the realization doesn't crush him. It sets him free. Karatayev's final story, told with rapturous joy by a dying campfire, is about a merchant framed for murder who suffers for decades, only to die in prison, right as the real killer confesses and the Tsar's pardon arrives. God forgave the merchant, but the state's justice was utterly irrelevant, arriving long after the man was in the ground. Pierre absorbs this not as a tragedy, but as a revelation. He sees there's no condition in which a man needs to lack freedom, precisely because freedom has nothing to do with controlling your circumstances. Pierre survives the brutal march because he stops treating his life as a narrative requiring his active authorship, abandoning the European illusion that he can engineer his own salvation, and accepts instead that he's merely a single drop of water expanding and contracting in an endless, impersonal ocean of divine movement. This is the violent core of Tolstoy's vision. It isn't just that the generals are incompetent or that military histories written by liars. The claims that individual will, the belief that you can steer events, plan an ambush, or shape your destiny is an arrogant fantasy that'll get you killed just as it got Petya killed when he charged into a courtyard, waving an unsharpened sword. Tolstoy demands we stop believing in deliberate historical action entirely, accepting that we aren't the players moving pieces on a board, but the weather itself, a blind accumulation of temperatures and pressures grinding forward without intent. You can't steer the campaign of 1812 any more than you can steer a blizzard, and the desire to impose a rational design on the carnage just a reflex to protect our vanity from the fact that we're entirely swept up in forces that don't know our names. Tolstoy insists that if we admit human life can be ruled by reason, the possibility of life is destroyed. And he doesn't mean this as a poetic metaphor about the unpredictability of romance. He means it as a devastating epistemological limit on how we're allowed to understand action. You look at the French retreat from Moscow, and military historians will give you a dozen strategic explanations for the collapse of the Grande Armée. But Tolstoy looks at the exact same data and sees only a natural phenomenon operating at the uniform rate of a mathematical progression. The retreating army wasn't defeated by brilliant tactical maneuvering. It melted away because it was a massive wounded organism bleeding out in the freezing snow, and any Russian general trying to dictate its path with a decisive battle was just a man shouting orders at an avalanche. Kutuzov alone understood this, recognizing that his job wasn't to generate brilliant strategies from a map room, but to align himself entirely with the unconscious will of the people, adopting patience and time not as a clever tactical delay, but as a total, almost biological submission to historical inevitability. Kutuzov is the anti-Napoleon because he realizes that a leader is just the foam riding the crest of the wave. Once the wave hits the shore and the Russian borders are secured, his utility evaporates. He couldn't comprehend the European balance of power because he wasn't a statesman. He was a blunt instrument of national survival, and an instrument can't outlive its single necessary function. Kutuzov has to die. This annihilation of the rational, planning self is exactly what Pierre Bezukhov has to undergo to be cured of his existential despair. Before the war, Pierre tormented himself trying to discover the aim of life, constructing elaborate mental edifices to figure out what he was supposed to do with his wealth and his freedom. It takes the absolute deprivation of a French prison camp where he's stripped of every choice and every comfort for him to realize that the search for a purpose was the very thing blinding him to the reality of his own existence. The text tells us that his dreadful question of what for vanishes, replaced by a permanent, joyous sense of freedom and a faith in an ever living, ever manifest God that he learned from the illiterate peasant Karatayev. This isn't the geometrically precise architect of the universe recognized by the Freemasons. Karatayev's God is vastly more indifferent and unfathomable. It's like trying to understand the ocean by mapping the coordinates of a single water molecule. The Freemasons were drawing grids on the water, but Karatayev taught Pierre how to drown. Pierre emerges from this moral bath radically altered, smiling at the contradictions of his friends because he no longer believes you can change a man's convictions with mere words. He stops searching for an aim. So when we finally reach the epilogue, the survivors have completely retreated from the historical stage into fiercely insulated domestic ecosystems, and Tolstoy is utterly unapologetic about the aesthetic cost of this withdrawal. Natasha Rostova, the glowing, vital center of the novel, is reduced to a strong, handsome, and fertile woman whose soul is entirely invisible. She stops singing, she abandons society, and she paces her nursery, displaying yellow stains on baby napkins to her aristocratic visitors. You can read the relentless domesticity of these final chapters as a conservative retreat, as if he's locking his retreat, as if he's locking his heroine in the delivery room just to punish her for her past vitality. But the move is darker and more structurally necessary than a simple bout of Victorian prudery. Natasha is behaving exactly like Kutuzov. She has recognized the only sphere where she possesses actual necessity, and she is submitted to the biological momentum of the family, just as the old general submitted to the historical momentum of the Russian masses. If the purpose of food is nourishment, she reasons. The purpose of marriage is the family, and anything outside that biological mandate is a dangerous distraction. This is why the novel is so unspeakably cruel to Sonia, describing her as a sterile flower, like some strawberry blossoms that yield no fruit. Sonia has the moral virtue, she has the self sacrifice, but she lacks the blind, organic drive that Tolstoy has elevated above all conscious morality. She is an evolutionary dead end. But the text won't let this domestic paralysis hold, and here the book stages a political rupture that cracks its own deterministic philosophy wide open. 7 years after the war, Pierre is suddenly back to his old habits, pacing the room and proposing a secret society, a Russian Tugendbund, to overthrow the government's oppressive mysticism and prevent a national catastrophe. Pierre's political project is to smuggle human agency back into the narrative, insisting that when the string is overstrained and catastrophe is inevitable, virtue isn't found in blind obedience to the state, but in the independent, politically conscious action of an alliance forged for mutual help. He tells his brother in law, Nicholas, that it's the duty of all decent men to counteract the ruin of the courts and the army. Nicholas is horrified. Nicholas has poured his entire post war existence into managing his estate by adopting the exact rhythms and values of the peasant laborer, viewing his serfs not as tools but as an end in themselves. He has found his absolute peace in the soil. He flatly tells Pierre that if he formed a secret society and the corrupt minister Arakcheev ordered him to lead a squadron against it, he wouldn't hesitate an instant to cut Pierre down. They are speaking across an abyss. Nicholas relies on the absolute mechanics of the military oath. Pierre relies on a moral imperative that transcends the state. Nicholas represents the novel's deepest philosophical commitment to accepting the world as it is. Pierre represents the incurable human itch to change it. Tolstoy gives the final word of this conflict to neither man, but to the orphan boy listening in the shadows. Little Nicholas, Prince Andrew's son, hears Pierre's treasonous idealism and falls into an ecstatic fever dream where he and Pierre are leading a massive army made of white slanting lines that float like autumn cobwebs. Les filles de la Vierge. The boy wakes in a cold sweat, clutching the broken sealing wax from his uncle's desk, vowing to perform some world historical act of glory that would make even his dead father proud, entirely oblivious to the fact that his father's life was destroyed by exactly this brand of ambition. Tolstoy has spent 1,000 pages systematically dismantling the romantic lie of the great man, proving that military ambition is a delusion and that the true essence of life is found only in submission to the immediate, the biological, and the ordinary. Yet the book ends by planting the exact same fatal seed of historical ambition in the mind of the next generation. The cycle of violence and ideological vanity will inevitably resurrect itself, fueled by the very children we retreated into the nursery to protect.